All right, everyone, welcome. Ex-Embers podcast. Scholar McLarney here and Schoolman Fawcett. We are talking today about monarchy. Is that a title?
Suppose so. Well, I suppose we are, of course, coming to you from Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore, the world's first and to date only online Chesterton Academy, and there's a lot of things that intersect when you talk about a topic like the British monarchy. Now, of course, it's been on my mind for obvious reasons because a couple of weekends ago was the coronation. Mm-hmm. When were you expecting to see the coronation in your lifetime? Did you ever expect to see it in your lifetime?
Can I be fully honest? I never even thought about it.
You thought? So you just took for granted that Queen Elizabeth would be there as long as you were alive. You never stopped to reflect on whether.
I don't know how many of my Republican tendencies are going to come out in this podcast. I'll try and keep them.
No, that's what this is for. This is for fleshing it out. We've had requests for a proper debate, and this is probably as close as we're going to get because we don't disagree on enough things to argue about. But
right.
It's okay. Okay, so you okay, so let's full disclosure. Let's cards on the table here. Dr. McLarney, with a name like McLarney,
yes,
you're obviously French.
Oui, je parle français.
So yeah, that's true. So Dr. McLarney is Irish and French. Which is why his name is Gerard with two R's, but he's pronounced Jared.
Well, yeah, actually, no, it's I don't have actually any French heritage.
You're kidding.
No, don't. Yeah.
So how did you come to teach at a French immersion school? You just had more initiative than your other
my parents are immigrants, and they sent me to a French school. There's different reasons perhaps why, but it was a trend.
So you still imbibed the Francophile mind.
That's right.
Francophone mind.
Well, or Francophile in the sense, yeah.
Okay.
But my teachers, so both my parents and my teachers, who are mostly Quebecois, did not infuse within me any necessarily deep love for the monarch. They had a maybe subtle Republican streak. It was never really an issue that was explicitly addressed. It was more perhaps implied or implicit. When you just asked me, like, what were you expecting at the coronation? Well, I didn't really have an answer because I wasn't really expecting anything.
Right, so it's like God in a secular school. They're not atheistic, but God is just a non-presence that you just don't think about.
Something like that, yes. And that might be an apt analogy where they're or deistic, like most Canadians, where we have this. If the analogy holds, this monarch in some other distant land who's just not involved in current affairs, or if we want to take a more hardened atheistic view, saying there should be no monarch whatsoever across our land, or we could be perhaps, and I think I'm just anticipating here a little bit, more theistic and saying no, we need to insist on the importance and role and dare I say, primacy of the monarch in our society, whether it's Canadian or otherwise. So anyhow, that's where I'm assuming you're going to take this.
Well, I'm not necessarily here to convince you of royalism. I more want to analyze it. Now, and full disclosure from me.
Yes.
So there are not a lot of post-nomials in Canadian history, like things you can put at the end of your name. There's not a lot of aristocratic titles, like Esquire or something like that.
Yes.
But there is one. It's UE. Letters U and E.
UE. Oh, really?
Short for United Empire Loyalist. And if you had an ancestor who fought against the Americans in the Revolutionary War,
yes,
apparently you are allowed to address yourself, or I guess sign yourself as your name, UE.
No way.
I am among the privileged group of people. I have no proprietary rights as far as I know. It doesn't make me a lord or anything, but I am allowed to call myself Brett Fawcett, UE, because I have two ancestors to my knowledge who fought in the American Revolutionary War on the Loyalist side in the New Brunswick area. Isaac Bonnell was one of them, and another one's name slips my mind. But I've got a friend who's really into genealogy.
Okay.
They tracked this down for me once and let me know that if I wanted to, I could apply for formal recognition of this. I haven't bothered to do that yet.
Okay.
Because putting Empire Loyalist in your name, I think these days would be contentious. Empires don't have the best reputation. Maybe we can talk about that someday.
Sure.
About imperialism. But I did have ancestors who fought for the monarchy. So it is something that's of interest to me. Is why would somebody feel so strongly about this institution that's overseas, right? That they would potentially lay down their life for it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, okay, that's interesting. So Brett Fawcett, UE, and I thought maybe this would be just another degree that you've earned. But no, this is
completely
okay.
unearned. This is an unearned increment of association.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Now, I will also disclose that I'm fascinated by the idea of monarchy for mostly Neoplatonic reasons, but in terms of looking at the scala natura, or the scale of being, and how humanity relates to creation and God and so forth. So I think there's some fascinating things that can go on there with monarchy. Although I do have some reservations too.
Okay.
Do we want? Where do you want to take this?
Let me just lay out what I think is the case for it in a general sense.
Okay.
Or at least like what the idea behind monarchy is. I mean,
yes.
What's the rationale behind putting all this power into this hereditary institution? Right?
Yes.
Why this Charles just had the privilege of happening to be the firstborn of Queen Elizabeth, who happened to be the firstborn of George VI. It's all coincidence. Why give them all this power, this vast amount of power they supposedly have?
Right.
And the coronation was an interesting demonstration of this. And also, we do have a coworker who happened to be in London at the time and graciously took some photographs, which I imagine Mrs. Wright is going to put on the screen right now. I don't know. Did you have a chance to review all of them and see?
I did look through them, and there's quite they're quite arresting, some of them, and just to see the crowds who are there. To see this momentous event. I mean, it's a historical event.
It is historic for sure, but it's also interesting that people really do care so deeply about it.
Yeah, and for a variety of reasons, right? So some purely because, this is the first time in 70 years that this has occurred, or some are pointing out, this is an ancient ritual that has been untouched or undeveloped in the last millennia, and thinking, when I read that, I'm like, it's not that old if it's only 1,000 years. But in any case, any case,
for Catholics, we have a longer pedigree than that. So
right.
We can do you one better. We can do twice as long. But yes, it is. It's not. Although it's not true that it's undeveloped, because it has changed.
Okay.
The coronation oath has changed, which we can talk a little bit about.
Oh, sure. And then, particularly in a fast-paced society where we see unprecedented change from year to year almost, right? These seismic shifts, this ground which moves beneath us, maybe this could be something enduring which we can look to, some sort of appeal there as well, right? Then perhaps fascination with the unknown, or at least what's mysterious about these sacred rituals and all the rest. That also, I think, has a certain allure. And then I think as well, when it comes to, dare I say, celebrity culture, where there's a certain attraction, is there not, for us to look towards those who are wealthy and famous, and in some cases powerful, right? So we kind of have a fascination, do we not, that allures our eye to extravagance.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
So as we discussed before with Persia and the Hunger Games, there's a natural kind of appeal or allure to extravagance. Yes. Sure.
Yes.
Well, okay. Yeah. So that's it. I think there's absolutely a lot to what you're saying. People are attracted to the fact that there's something ancient about it, and there's a natural draw towards celebrity, which, as we were discussing off camera, C.S. Lewis, that was one of his points in favor of monarchy, was sure, it's easy to debunk a monarchy. It's easy to show that it's absurd, but watch what happens when you get rid of it. People just end up transferring that allegiance to celebrities.
Right.
In some cases, it's gangsters, he even says,
sure, or
actors or singers. Right? They become the new monarchy.
Or sports figures.
Sports figures as well. I mean, look at the ways. I mean, Elvis Presley was the king.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
So maybe there is something natural and spontaneous about our celebrity, and let's call it worship, that monarchy, in some sense, redirects towards civil good. Right, towards public spiritedness. This would be one of my arguments for it. Sure, it seems silly, but it's almost inevitable. So we may as well find some way of leveraging it for political sentiment.
Okay. Well, you've half convinced me.
Oh, okay. Well,
Okay.
well, that's not bad for this early on. Okay. Well, okay. Well, let me talk about. Let me try to lay this out as best I can.
Sure. And, well, I guess just to jump in, one other thing that
sure,
got me interested was Father Raymond de Souza, who's been tracking this as well in Canadian media, and he likes to write about the monarchy as well. And so he pointed out how Pope Francis had donated, I guess, for lack of a better term, relics of the True Cross to King Charles.
Yes.
And so that also got me thinking more about this and the religious history and symbolism and what's going on in the ritual of coronation.
The anointing of the king.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's one could say, I've heard it said that chivalry is created on Good Friday, the idea of laying down one's life for a friend,
Right.
and Christian monarchy is founded on Holy Thursday, right, when the king washes the feet of his servants, which is a tradition of monarchs actually, of Maundy Thursday. There's something. Well, and it's not just the Pope actually. I have the details here, but the oil to anoint him for his coronation is from the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
The Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, right, and the Anglican Archbishop. They consecrated it,
ceremony,
right? Which is very interesting. Of course, Charles himself has Greek Orthodox roots.
Okay.
His father was from the Greek royal family,
Yeah.
and his grandmother actually, of course, was sort of a Greek Orthodox nun who may have had schizophrenia.
Okay.
I think Sigmund Freud actually looked at her. Her life was like nuts, but who also concealed Jewish people during from the Nazis.
Okay.
So she's one of the righteous among the Gentiles. So there's a very interesting Greek Orthodox lineage actually, or like in the background.
Okay.
I know he's been to Mount Athos as well, actually, Charles. There's a lot we can say about Charles. I hope we do talk a bit about him. But that's true. Yeah, the fact that the True Cross was represented there.
Yes.
Hopefully we'll talk about this. That conjunction between Christ's rule and human rule is sort of on display there. But let me talk about
let's hear it.
The premise behind the British monarchy, because you can't. What it really is it's the idea of the British Constitution. Right? You can't. You're not just talking about the monarchy as this separate thing. It's part of a whole system. And to understand it, I think you actually need to start with Aquinas. In the first part of the second part of the Summa, question 105, he says, he argues, so he does a couple of things. He's talking, first of all, about this book, The Politics of Aristotle, which he also wrote a commentary on. I don't know that he finished it. He also wrote a book on kingship as well. But he argues that ancient Israel had the best political system.
Okay.
He quotes Numbers 24, "How beautiful are your tabernacles and your tents, O Jacob." And of course, politics, means like city, like houses, households in a city, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And he says that there are two things you need for right ordering of a state or nation. One is that all should take some share in the government, and he quotes Aristotle's Politics for this.
Okay.
Right? The other point is that there's different kinds of constitutions, and of course, this is from Aristotle too, right? You have monarchy and tyranny, right? You have aristocracy and oligarchy, and then you have the polity and the democracy. And each of those, there's a good, it's the good version of the bad version, or vice versa, right? Monarchy is the best of all, and by monarchy he just means essentially like an absolute dictatorship, right? Something like Plato's Philosopher King. That would be the best system. Unfortunately, if it goes wrong, you have tyranny, which is the very worst system.
Right. Yes.
Aristocracy would be pretty good too, but unfortunately, that too easily devolves into oligarchy. A polity is sort of a constitutional democracy, is not capable of the same greatness as a absolute great philosopher king or of an idealized aristocracy. But on the other hand, a democracy is also not capable of as much evil as an oligarchy or a tyranny. Right. So you kind of, in a very Aristotelian way, you kind of have to go for the middle. Right? You meet in the middle, you go for the golden mean, right? So what Aquinas says is that the best form of government in a state or kingdom is in one where the power is given to preside over all, while under him are others having governing powers. And yet a government of this kind is shared by all, because all are eligible to govern, because the rulers are chosen by all. And this is the best form of polity. It's partly kingdom, partly aristocracy, and partly democracy, i.e. government by the people. So it's kingdom because there's one at the head of all. It's aristocracy insofar as a number of persons are set in authority. There's partly democracy because the rulers can be chosen from the people, and the people have the right to choose their rulers.
Okay.
He argues this is actually the Mosaic system.
Okay.
He quotes Deuteronomy, right? Moses is the king, and there's 72 men who were chosen. But he says there's a democratical government insofar as the rulers were chosen from among all the people. And he sort of seems to suggest that, well, these were like kind of provided by the people, they were picked. So he says that is the best.
Can I borrow your pen there?
Yes,
okay.
please.
And I write on this? Okay, keep going.
Okay, sure, of course. See, this is why I brought it. Is for this. Now, so that's what, there's more Aquinas says. But so this mixed constitution, he thinks, is the very best model, right? Now, there's a theorist named Sir John Fortescue. You're writing right now on an article about him that I was reading before. Okay. And Fortescue argued, he's writing about the British Constitution shortly after the Magna Carta. Right? And he says that the British Constitution captures this the best. And he contrasts this with actually the French monarchy at the time. And you remember the French monarchy, right? Like there's conflict between the king and the French. The French king and the Pope.
Je suis l'État.
It's never,
right? I am the state.
Yeah, there's, well, yeah, this is like in the 14th century. This is Philip the Fair, even.
Oh, okay.
Like, even before you got like all the other Louis going nuts, or Napoleon, right? It's already Philip the Fair wants to, like, he's the one who burns the Knights Templar. Right?
Okay.
He's like centralizing, right, all his power. And then the Pope actually issues his encyclical Unum Sanctum against Philip, saying, the Pope, right, has two swords, the spiritual and temporal. And in response to that, Philip just takes over the bishopric, basically, and it even like kind of imprisons the Pope at one point. Like it leads to a whole bunch of, so there's already, he suggests, I mean, Fortescue's already talking about this right after the Magna Carta, that the French tendency is towards a central absolutist monarchy. Which we'll see is exactly what develops, right? Whereas the British system, he thinks, and he's explicit about this, is Thomistic, right? It has the king, and he reigns, and in a sense can do no wrong, but he can't reign without Parliament, which represents the people, is chosen from among the people. They pass the laws that constrain the king, but they also, the power ends up kind of flowing from the king, which is also important because this is interesting too, because there's sort of a sense that the monarchy is the most ultimately democratic thing, because Aquinas says this too in the first part of the second part, question 97. The sovereign has no power to frame laws except as representing the people, because each individual cannot make laws, but the whole people can. So in some sense, the laws do emerge from the people, but you can't just have a whole bunch of people getting together and making laws, like according to Aquinas. Somehow the whole people has to do this, and they do this through their representative, who is the king.
Okay.
And Fortescue develops this, right? That the king is in some sense the embodiment or representative of the people, which leads into what we've talked about, which is the king's two bodies. The sense that in some sense there's the king, and we'll get into this, I'm sure you have something to say, but we'll get into examples of how this played out in history in a minute. But that there's the king's natural body.
So this is the king's two bodies. So Mr. Fawcett here is going to explain what this is, with this theology, which mostly develops, I want to say, in France. I mean, they're not exclusively French thinkers, but most of these references, I think, do come from French theologians in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, Kantorowicz, I think is how you say it, he writes this book in the 50s on it, The King's Two Bodies, A Study in Medieval Political Theology, I think is what it's called. And he gives examples. I mean, well, Fortescue has this too. But yeah, there's French theorists. I mean, you can sort of see it even in Aquinas and what we saw. But that the king has two bodies. He's both his physical, natural body, the body that we all have, but he also has the whole body politic.
Right.
That in some sense he is carrying around with him. Right. And the coronation is where that's really put on display. That he's donning the whole body. That's why he's holding the globe with the cross over it, right?
Yes.
That's why he's wearing these symbolic robes, that he's in some sense become invested with the whole people, which is why there's actually part of the coronation oath, or part of the ritual is the part where the choir all chants God Save the King. That's actually the Archbishop asking, like, essentially, will you have this man as your king? And symbolically on behalf of the people, they're saying, yes, God Save the King, right? Viva Rex, right?
Right, okay.
And in turn, the king is making certain promises, like, as your representative, I will enact all the laws that are made by you in Parliament, basically. I mean, that's me making those laws in Parliament. But, so that there are, in a sense, two kings, which is how, in one sense, the monarchy is eternal and represents everybody, but it's also a guy. And at times you can even separate those two. But that's where there's the representational aspect, which I think you can see even today, like in these crowds you were talking about. There's, in spite of its seeming anti-democratic character, there's still, like Hilaire Belloc called it the popular monarchy, right? People still seem invested in the king in
Yes.
some sense. In literal,
Yeah.
I mean invested, right? Like
Yes.
he's wearing them somehow. And,
Right.
and that's the ideal of what the monarchy is. Now, there's more I could say about this, but I can
Yeah.
tell you want to interject. So,
Well, I mean, some other interesting things, well, some reservations, I might say, about the two-body theories. When I'm reading these theologians, and it was flooring to read it at first, because these were compiled by a Princeton professor in the
Yeah,
1950s. And when I first read it, I didn't read the first few paragraphs closely enough. And I thought it was him who was
Right,
writing this
arguing
about the
this,
monarch.
yes.
And my jaw dropped, hit the floor. I was reading what he was trying to say. But basically, in the different theologians differ. But part of my reservation is it seems, well, one is the body natural is elevated by the body politic. So it almost as if the king has two natures, and it's very
Like
much
Christ.
like Christ. Yes, it's very much like a hypostatic union. So you perhaps St. Athanasius fans out there will know this quote: "God became man so that man could become God," and so it's very much that nature that his infirmity even are elevated, and the body politic, when it joins to the body natural, elevates the status of the king, and it's something that in itself, a very Neoplatonic idea, is almost this true form, this eternal form that cannot be diseased, it cannot diminish, and so on. So it's a fascinating concept. But when I read it, it seems like these are bureaucrats, theologians who are giving a rationale for why we have this king. That's perhaps maybe a more cynical way of reading it. A more generous way of reading it, I think, would be to say these are thorough Christians who are so infused with the Paschal mystery that they want to see Christ in everything and think, okay, well, how can we make this work in our political system? Oh, I know. This is how we can do it when it comes to the king. So kind of two different reactions when we're looking at it. It's one of admiration to say, wow, what ingenuity that these thinkers had in terms of propping up this theology of the king, which mirrors so closely the theology of the hypostatic union, right? So humanity joined to divinity. So the earthly king, or the body of the king, joined to the natural body, body politic. Yeah. So these join together. Those are some ways of reading it. But
sure. Can I point out though?
Sure.
I grant what you're saying, but it's worth remembering that it's not as though they are inventing monarchy in this way, or Christian monarchy, right? This is something that's developed, and as kind of said, they're reflecting on it.
Yes.
And that's also a point in its favor, from like a Burkean perspective, from a Chestertonian perspective even, right? One of the advantages of this weird system is that it evolved. Right?
Okay.
It developed out of the kind of accumulated stock of wisdom, again,
Yes.
to use the sort of Burkean, Chestertonian language. And then, okay, well, now this thing's developed, and it's going to keep developing, so let's reflect on what it actually is. And in some sense, even saying that since God is in charge of history, God has kind of produced this force. I mean, because they trace it back to, a lot of this is happening after the Norman conquest, right? After William the Conqueror, right? After Hastings, right?
Yeah.
The institution, in some sense, dates back to Edward the Confessor, right? And it's interesting that they don't try to erase him, right? After the Norman kings come in, they want this continuity with him. In fact, that's actually, if I remember right, that's why they get why the coronation happens at Westminster Abbey is because it was built by Edward, I want to say.
Okay.
So they really want to have this connection to this saintly king, like this strange holy fool of a king who could apparently heal people and may have been celibate in his marriage, right?
Yeah.
They want this. They still want to maintain a connection to him. But these theologians and these political theorists and these bureaucrats are reflecting on this thing that's developed. For example, the Magna Carta, right? We have King John, who's the villain of the Robin Hood stories, right?
Yeah.
Awful Prince John, right? Who's ruling while his brother is off fighting crusades, right?
Yeah.
Magna Carta, which is written by Archbishop Stephen Langton, who, if you don't recognize that name,
does he give us the divisions in the Bible?
That's exactly it.
Okay.
The two things he did was he divided the Bible into chapters, and he wrote the Magna Carta in 1215, same year as the Fourth Lateran Council.
Okay.
Right. And so this is developed, but again, the Magna Carta claims to be part of the ancient British Constitution.
Right.
So the idea is that we've inherited this thing and need to make sense of it. And okay, well, what, like you said, they're so imbued with this analogical theology, right? Of seeing everything through the lens of Christ, and understanding that the church has an active role in the world, right?
Yep.
So it's not as though like the hypostatic union of Christ just exists in theology. It has some kind of implication for the world. In fact, you could think about even the understanding of priesthood, right?
Yeah.
Because in some sense, there's a dual body thing going on there. Right? There's the priest, the sinner, but there's also the priest in persona Christi.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, and I haven't found anyone who refers to this, but at least in those medieval theologians, if anyone knows anyone, let us know. But I was even thinking about Romans 13.
Okay.
Right. That the state is the minister of God. And the
Mm-hmm.
Greek there is what, Dr. McLarney?
Oh, minister.
It's diakonos. Actually.
Oh, the servant.
It's
Okay.
actually that's.
Okay.
I guess it depends on your translation.
Yeah.
But I'm familiar with the old King James,
Sure.
which calls it minister, which sounds very explicitly ecclesiastical.
Okay.
But deacon, I mean, it's the same word that's used. It's not necessarily technically deacon, but it's used that way a lot in Scripture. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the idea that there's something diaconal, let's say, or
Yes.
ministerial, right, with
Yes.
the government. I mean, this takes that and really institutionalizes that, right, by seeing it as almost clerical. Right?
Maybe. Okay. Okay.
Well, I mean, the fact that that's an anointing, right?
Well, I'm not sure Romans 13 is going to use the word anointing.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Right, but it, I mean, we'll say it's not for.
But a couple chapters later, it refers to Phoebe, same word, right, as a servant of the church.
Okay.
Obviously, like Nero is not
Yeah.
is not a minister in the same way. But like, government in general is ordained by God to execute this apocalyptic wrath. That's what Romans 13 is saying.
Yeah, well, not even necessarily apocalyptic. It can be realized in the sense that it's not for no reason that the sword has been given to the emperor, right? So Paul is saying there that within God's purview or the plan of creation, yeah, there is authority on earth, and so this happens to be the sword, right? And there's the perhaps generous view that this is going to be used for a meting out punishment where needed, right? So that's there. I don't know if you can, based on that, make all necessarily the same connections that you'll have with the two bodies. I mean, I
don't think you could deduce it. I don't think you'd read Romans 13 and get like a coronation out of that necessarily.
Yeah, right.
But what this thing that's developed is, okay, well, we understand Christ to be the king of the world, and ultimately the government derives its authority from God. I mean, that's Romans 13 for sure.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Given our understanding of that, what should it look like? And organically, this thing seems to have developed of having it be a quasi-clerical ceremony, and an analogy to Christ having two natures is how we're going to understand the kingship. And here's another thing on this point, though, because this is something a student asked me about in class, actually.
Okay.
So it prompted a reflection that I appreciated.
Yeah.
So obviously there's this great danger with kings of tyranny, right? As Aristotle talks about, and it's in 1 Samuel as well. The people ask for a king, and there's that famous passage that Thomas Paine quotes in his book Common Sense, calling for the American Revolution, right? About if you get a king, he's going to tax you, he's going to take your best kids and send them to war, and he's going to make your life terrible, right? Which is, of course, what happens under Rehoboam, and that all goes pretty poorly, right? So how do you limit that? Well, and this goes back to Aquinas, right? Well, you need laws, right?
Okay.
You need laws which are participations in God's law. That's, of course, Aquinas' definition of law is a ordinance by the legitimate government of reason, promulgated for the common good. Right? You need laws to confine dictatorship, basically.
Yeah.
Well, again, the monarch, and the fact that he or she only has their authority by virtue of the fact that they were born, that automatically makes people suspicious of them.
Oh, yes.
Right? That puts a cap on their power, as opposed to the American presidency, whose power just keeps expanding. Right?
Oh,
if you think about how many more executive orders have been issued, right, by the last few presidencies. Like their federal government's power just seems to keep expanding because there's this faux democratic legitimacy to them, right? As opposed to the monarch, which there's an immediate suspicion of because they're just inherited, right?
Yeah.
But the monarch can act, but he can't really legislate, not on his own, right? He can only legislate, and this is, the Magna Carta, this is Fortescue, this is Bracton, who's writing right after Magna Carta. He can only pass laws with all these representatives of the people. with what becomes the Parliament, essentially.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful line from Bracton that I want to make sure I quote accurately, where he says,
It reminds you again what year about is
this is
Bracton?
the 14th century, I want to say 13th or 14th century, but he says, so the king has a superior, namely God, and the law by which he was made king is also his superior, and also his curia, the earls and barons, because if he is without a bridle, that is to say, without law, they ought to put the bridle on him. So if the king so the king is made king by the laws, and if the king acts lawlessly, people can actually use the laws to bridle him, right? Another line, he says, the king has no equal within his realm, because subjects can't be equals of the ruler, because he would thereby lose his rule, because equal can have no authority over equal, etc. So he says the king can't have any equals. He has to be the superior. The king cannot be under man, but under God and under the law, because the law makes the king. And he has this kind of pun, I guess you could say, in Latin. There is no rex where there is no lex.
Okay.
So there has to be law in place to actually make the king. And if the king starts to violate that, you can actually use the law to curb him.
Yeah.
Now this thing kind of develops, which is the doctrine that the king can do no wrong.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that whatever the king does is okay. What it means is that, and this goes back to the two bodies thing.
Yeah.
The king can't be found liable of breaking the law. That would lead to all sorts of chaos.
Yeah.
So what happens instead is he can only act through his cabinet. He acts
Right.
through his ministers, right? His
Sure.
prime minister, the cabinet. They act on the king's behalf, and they can be found guilty, right? They can be found, you violated the law. The king is sort of left untouched by that.
Yes.
but his ministers can be found guilty and gotten rid of. And in extreme cases, if the king himself does violate the law, he no longer is king. And because notice that phrase, there's no rex where there's no lex.
Okay.
This is important because Aquinas is sometimes sort of cited as like the first Whig. Lord Acton called him that, because he sort of seems to suggest you can get rid of unjust kings.
Oh, and so reminder, Canadian, perhaps American listeners as well. What is a Whig?
Well, Whig would be like a liberal, right?
Okay.
The first I don't know, grit.
Okay.
No, but
The
the first
Canadian?
a
Yeah,
believer in sort of Lockean principles that the government it only rules by the consent of the governed and all this. Well, what Aquinas says is, and this is sort of consistent, I think, with the Catholic tradition, is that if the king acts unlawfully, he's not king anymore.
Okay.
Right? The crown is still intact.
Yes.
The crown is still okay, but you can sever that, right? And that's what you have with Edward II. Edward II, who's the one who has his male favorites that he likes to dally with, and prefers doing that to governing. Eventually, he's sort of forced to abdicate, and he's put on trial for violating his coronation oath.
Okay.
The coronation oath is, I promise I will obey all the, this is important, it's the future perfect. I will enforce all the laws that the people will have chosen.
Okay.
So he's committing in advance to, I will abide by the laws that I enact through my people.
Right.
When he fails to do that, he's gotten rid of, and this happens, of course, with Richard II as well,
Okay.
right, who Shakespeare writes this wonderful play about, where he openly abdicates his crown and withdraws from the body politic into his body natural, right? So there's this interesting thing develops where the king is bound by a law, and yet is somehow still the crown is still kept untainted by that, in a way that doesn't happen with presidential systems. Like look at what's happening in the States right now, right? With Trump has muddied this so much, right? And of course now even Biden, right? Historic confidential documents at his house and all this sort of thing. Like there's not that severability you can have, because it seems like it's actually the president himself who might be above the law for as long as he's in power. As President Nixon said, right? Like, if the president does it, it is not illegal, right? Well, there's not that severability that kind of happens with the King's Two Bodies doctrine. Yeah,
well, there is grounds for impeachment, though, right? So impeachment can occur, and I think the president is an interesting analog to the idea of king, right? So as head of state, it just says in a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen is the head of the state. Immunity is a good one, right? So we're in power. He's above the law, I guess.
Sure, yes.
And someone who's exalted. Now, from Bracton, you had an interesting quote there about the king can have no equals.
Yes.
And what was the rationale he gave again?
Well, basically, the subjects cannot be equals of the ruler because he would thereby lose his rule, since equal can have no authority over equal.
Right.
Because then
Yes.
then he would be subject to those subjected to him.
Yeah. Okay.
So he's superior to his people, and yet he can't legislate without them.
Right. So, which is very similar to a presidential system as well, right? That you have, instead of a king, you have a president, and instead of rulers or the aristocrats, you have senators and representatives, and who rule through the people, right? So I don't think it's necessarily that worlds apart in that respect.
Well, it's been said though, that the American Revolution kept monarchy but left the king. Right. That what we basically have now in England, you have a king without monarchy, and in America, you have monarchy without king.
Right.
Because the president exercises a lot of the authority that the medieval king had. Like he can veto legislation, right?
Yeah.
Which is what the medieval monarch could do. He could withhold royal assent or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And again, with more legitimacy, right? I mean, George Washington, of course, famously, like Gideon, right? He declines having a crown, right? But the federal government has since just kept on growing. Right, and I think I would say this too in a similar way to how we as Catholics believe that, like, okay, do priests need to be celibate? Not necessarily. Of course, the Eastern Church doesn't do it that way. But there's kind of this understanding that if you're going to be consecrated for this very special role, there have to be certain. There's privileges that come with being in persona Christi, but there's also denials that have to happen.
Yeah.
It's interesting. In America, you can be president for up to 8 years.
Yes.
Right? But then you're basically back to being a private citizen. Now you can be very, civic-minded, of course, your whole life. I'm sure all the presidents are. But you're essentially renting the country.
Okay.
Whereas the monarch is set apart for his whole life, right? In theory from childhood, in theory from infancy, right?
Okay.
With this sense of public spiritedness.
Yes.
Now, sometimes you're blindsided by this, right? Like George VI became king because his older brother abdicated.
Yeah.
Which is interesting too, right? He abdicated because he wanted to marry a divorcee, and that was incompatible with the Church of England's teaching. So he had to give up the crown in order to kind of, he had to withdraw from the body politic and do his body natural, and then as a duty, it fell to his younger brother. So sometimes you're surprised, but there's still the sense that like your whole being is sort of cultivated for the sake of the Commonwealth, and it's something you're going to bequeath to your children after you. Unless they, of course, abdicate themselves, right? So I'm not saying that, presidents can't have that, but this is really institutionalized, right? That your whole identity is tied up with your people, and the identity of your family is tied up with the people.
Yes.
And a point that, Tolkien would make as well, right, is that you didn't choose this. Right. It's a duty imposed upon you, as opposed to a president. And you and I know people who are politicians, and yes, you can feel called as a vocation to be in politics, and you run because you think God is calling you to. That's fine, but you still have to kind of assess yourself as being good enough for this role, right? You still have to pursue the role, right?
You hope so.
You're right. Well, one would hope. And as Tolkien points out, nolo episcopari, right? If you want to be bishop, you shouldn't be bishop. Right?
Okay.
A bishop should be like Ambrose and not want the role. He should have to be dragged there.
Right.
Anyone who wants to be a bishop is insane and shouldn't be the bishop. Shouldn't that also be true of politics? The highest office in the land shouldn't go to somebody who wants it.
Right.
Which Chesterton says is really why the king is the ultimate everyman.
Yeah.
Right? Because in a sense, that's the short, in a sense, and this is the Chestertonian paradox, right? The most democratic way in the world to choose somebody is just by the accident of birth.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know if I could go with that because, there's a few problems there. I think. A few things. So, when you talk about the growth of government, right? Well, look at Canada, which does not have a presidency. Government has grown exponentially in the last decade or two. So we have a magnificent growth in government. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily tied so much to presidency. But another point about choosing to be, a politician or a leader of a party. Yeah, I suppose there is that as well. But just look at both in Canada and the United States, who's been in power. And very often it's certain families, right? So certain families, I mean, it's
Right, yes.
ostensibly a democratic system where
Well, I
anybody can be
remember
elected.
seeing Dick Cheney and Barack Obama are like eighth cousins or something like that.
Oh, is that, okay, yeah.
And I believe also related to the royal family.
Oh, is that right? Okay,
So,
sure.
well, I have a rebuttal to what you're saying, but keep
Okay,
going.
but
Say it
yeah,
first.
right. So whether you're wherever you are from Quebec, right, whatever families you're connected to, or in the States, the Clintons were in power for quite some time. Same with the Bushes, right? And so perhaps.
And William Lyon Mackenzie King was the grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie, right? Who was the revolutionary who became mayor of Toronto. So sure,
Okay,
yeah,
so maybe they decided they had some initiative, but certainly they were cultivated and groomed and all the rest. So that's going on there as well. Now the bit about the genetic lottery, though, this part I think is the Achilles heel, as far as I see it, in a monarchy. I certainly appreciate the idea of this someone you can look up to, right? So this someone who's beyond just the plebs, right? So just beyond, more than just equal, right? More equal than equal. And I think this is one of the profound weaknesses in democracy, right? Is that in the democratic horizon, we don't have anyone to look up to, right? So and without someone to look up to, well, where is your vision going to turn? Well, it's yourself, right? So it's going to be insular. And when you turn inward, what do you find? Well, you find your appetites. So your drive now becomes to satiate your pleasure, or maybe you become acquisitive and you drive in materialistic ends, right? And so that's one of the major drawbacks of a democratic horizon. Is that you have, it's like a boomerang, right? It's self-reflexive, and so how do you get out of that, right? Well, some ways are through faith, right? Religion, morality. These lift our chin, right? They raise our heads to beyond just ourselves, to whether it's natural law or the divine law, we now, or the divine man, the God man, right? We have a vision, all right, someone we can emulate, so we can still strive for excellence and reach our telos, right? Completion in life, because otherwise we lack meaning and purpose without that. So the kingship or queenship, right? Monarchy, on the surface, seems to play into that a little bit, in that it provides us with a superior that we can then attempt to emulate. But this is as I see it, when it comes to the genetic lottery, it's like, well, but I'm not in that family, so how can I possibly strive to emulate them, right? And so that's its downfall, right? When it comes to a monarchy, in that I can't actually emulate them because there's this massive gulf between them, has to do with our last names, and so I can't get in there. We could change that, though. Maybe let's just say this is perhaps a remedy. We'll give your family a century. Okay, that gives you one generation at least, 2 or 3 maybe, where you can rule. And then, let's switch it up a little bit. So then we give it to someone else for another century. That would be a much fairer lottery.
By the end of that century, people would stop. Arguably, there'd be less incentive for the monarch to care. Because I know, après moi le déluge, right? After that, my son's not going to inherit this monarchy. Some other family's going to. So what's the incentive?
But what's the incentive to care anyhow if my son's going to inherit no matter what? Right. So
you may not want to lose the legitimacy of your family because you don't want your. I'm sure the Queen was concerned about that when her son was having all that dalliance, involving Camilla and Diana, right? So there's that long-term investment. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're making an interesting case for what is commonly called aristocracy. I mean, this is seen as being terrible too, right? Oh, in the British aristocracy, right? It's just this, landed, these families that just their ancestors fought in some war, so they get property. These monasteries that were turned into manors. Fair enough, but I mean, is that avoidable? I mean, we, for goodness sake, in a month, in less than a month, half a month, we're having an election, and our premier may become Rachel Notley, whose father was the head of the NDP before her. So maybe there's something to be said that these families that are in power, that's just an inevitability. And again, at least aristocracy and monarchy redirects that towards the common good in a guaranteed way. I did appreciate a lot of what you're saying. I mean, I would suggest
no, the past tense there did.
I appreciate. I'm sorry. I'll make it present tense. I mean, I suppose you could say, though, I mean, I don't think that necessarily, I think this is very democratic of you to say, I don't think necessarily our heroes have to be people we could be, right? Because like the Blessed Mother, right? None of us are born without original sin, and yet she's still aspirational for us. I hope the Pope is aspirational, but most of us can't be Pope, right? So I take your point. We need those kind of people. We need those kind of heroes in society as well, but I don't think it needs to be limited to them per se. But I also I do want to say, because you're platonic.
Okay, but with the heroes though, yeah. So I do agree. We do need heroes. So I need great teachers, right? I need to look up to great teachers if I want to know how to be a teacher. Okay, if I want to be a dad, a great dad, I need to look up to other great dads. Right? I need to know how they've behaved. Right? I have to somehow imitate them. To learn. If I just want to be a good human being, right, in this world, I need to look up to other good humans to know how they've gone through their story. And so, much like Tolkien, he disdains allegory. So we can't put a story on repeat and just change its clothing and characters, or the names at least, and replay it. Every story is going to be different, but we do need those exemplars. So I'm agreeing on that.
Okay, sure.
But I don't. Well, I have some considerable reservations in terms of the way it's set up. But here, my suggestion would be an alternative. It's not necessarily hockey players that we erect our statues, at least in this part of the world. Those are the ones we have where we name our streets after. It doesn't have to be celebrities. I wouldn't say it even has to be the wealthy or the aristocrats, those particular families. Perhaps there's some things that they do that is worth imitating, but I don't see that per se as a good reason why, just because they're successful in monetary ways or with land or whatever it is. Rather, I would say look at the saints, right? So those are the heroes of this world that we look to, the prophets, the psalmists, the martyrs, the confessors, right? Those holy men and women who've gone before us and still live amongst us. Those are the ones whom we need to imitate.
Many of whom were monarchs.
Okay.
Just worth
mentioning.
And I'm not just trying to be facetious. There may be an analogy there, because I do see. I think Balthazar. I find Balthazar convincing about this, and he doesn't talk about monarchy as far as I really know, but the idea that our personhood is found in our mission. Right? There's almost a king's two bodies thing here, right? Like he talks about there's our soul, there's us as individuals, but until we get our role in the theodrama, we're not really persons, right? And once we have that mission from God, that's when we become full persons. And that, in a sense, that mission is external to us, and we need to conform ourselves to it. And he does indicate that, and there's not a one-to-one analogy, but that there's an understanding of this in the traditional idea of aristocracy and monarchy, right? Like noblesse oblige, right? By virtue of the fact that you're an aristocrat, that means there are duties imposed upon you, right? Is the idea.
Yes.
You're given, and again, and the monarchy, the British monarchy, you have inherited this thing that is external to you. So even if, like Elizabeth, as depicted on the Netflix show The Crown, right? Even if you think your sister should be allowed to marry this divorcee, your obligations as head of the Church of England mean you have to deny yourself in favor.
Well, okay, I'm all in favor of this external mission, right? That's imposed upon you. And when they do research, particularly, it doesn't have to be the royal family, but those who have been in those families and have abdicated or refused to take up the roles, they find much less, or they report less satisfaction in life. Whereas those who do end up following the obligations that they have, attending the functions that they do, the charities and so on.
Are you saying Prince Harry is not happy with Meghan Markle, as he would be if he continued to be a functionary of the Crown?
Absolutely, yes. And so when we do conform to these external vocations that we have, we will find fulfillment. That's certainly something I agree with. But I don't think this is a necessary institution for those to exist. And in fact, we already have. They're just built into us, both bottom up and top down, and through revelation, right? So built into us in the sense that, say, as parents, right? There's all sorts of obligations that are forced upon us. Whether we choose to abdicate or not is another question. But in as much as we deny ourselves and pick up our little children, right? And there we find meaning and fulfillment in all the other corrections and emails that we send as teachers, right? And all the rest. Yes. So we take up these responsibilities, even though we don't necessarily seek them out. And that brings meaning and fulfillment.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Sure. I don't think that it's a requirement, but okay, it'd be. I would compare it to something like, again, I go back to the knighthood in the Middle Ages, right? Yep. The soldier ideal of the Christian is something we find in the New Testament. Now, does that mean, that Christians have to be soldiers in some sense, or we have to have a soldiery, or a Christian soldier?
Okay, explain that to me, though. Well, what do you mean the soldier ideal?
Well, I mean, the New Testament is constant. I mean, it uses the imagery a great deal, right?
Are you thinking like the armor of God?
Yeah, the armor of God, and right, and just the apocalyptic imagery in general, right? Is that we are. And even the sacrament, the term sacrament, right, comes from this initiation, military, right? Exactly, right? Which is in spite of all of the calls for peace, right? But the way that let's say the Knights Templar and these other chivalric orders developed was, okay, well, we are in a historical situation now where it seems like we have to take up arms. Okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean to take up arms as a Christian?
Yeah.
This is what kind of developed. Surely it will keep developing, but we still have the Knights of Columbus. We still have various chivalric orders in the church. Similarly, again, I'm not saying you can deduce the British monarchical system from Scripture, but what I'm saying, what it seems to me is that...
It's compatible, maybe? Is that what you're saying? Or is
I think so. It's the most compatible, and it institutionalizes it the most clearly. Because, yes, obviously, like and there are, saintly presidents and prime ministers, for sure. But institutionally, this seems to commend it the most, to uphold these ideals the most, of the fact that there has to be self-denial and something bigger than yourself, and that it comes ultimately from God, right? And yes, it's true that in the American system you swear on the Bible, but there is something different about that as opposed to the almost ontological change, right, that happens in a coronation ceremony. Let me say a couple. I do want to say a couple things in case I forget them.
Sure. Okay.
But one of them is in response to the growth of government, and that's absolutely true. The government's grown in general, basically. But I would suggest, and this is why Tolkien called himself an anarcho-monarchist, that may be related to the reduced power of the monarchy, right? Because if the monarch were able to dismiss bad kings, dismiss bad ministers, bad prime ministers more frequently and more at their own discretion, maybe there would be less growth of government. So Canada, we're Canadians. Maybe we should have opened with this, that we're both Canadians.
Okay.
If you haven't inferred that yet. It seems to me that Canadians have actually done the best job of explaining monarchy. I'd point to George Grant. I'd also point to John Farthing's book, if you can find it. It's on PDF online, Freedom Wears a Crown. But it was at one point the case that lieutenant governors and governor generals who represented the crown were more confident to dismiss, either not give royal assent to legislation or even to dismiss politicians who were bad, or like leaders who were bad. It happened in Alberta. Our social credit government tried to pass some laws against free speech, and the governor general lieutenant governor just refused to sign it into law. Okay.
Also, when we tried to make our own currency.
We tried to make our own currency. Which was unconstitutional. I mean, this was all later all upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. Okay. There was also a case of like a prohibition, I think somewhere in the Maritimes, or maybe I can't remember where. I have some examples. Yeah. But this has been reduced. So it used to be that it was seen as legitimate for the royal power, let's say, to withhold royal assent if they deemed the law was unjust, or even to dismiss the government if they thought they were incompetent. That happened in Quebec, I want to say, at least once. That the lieutenant governor was just like, you are so bad at your job, I'm dismissing all of you and calling an election. That hasn't happened federally since 1926, which was when Prime Minister Mackenzie King asked the governor general to call an election, it's complicated and kind of boring. Basically, like the Liberals didn't have a majority, but they were probably going to stay in power because there was the Progressive Party that was going to support them against the Conservatives, who had more members than they did. Anyways, King asked the Lieutenant Governor Byng to call an election, and he said no. Yeah. And that all became kind of chaotic, and it ended up, the culmination of it was that King came back, I think, with a greater majority, and basically the Governor General learned not to mess. From now on, the Governor General should defer to the Prime Minister no matter what. So it seems to me that if we still had kings who were willing to exercise their veto power, or their power of overthrowing or kicking out their ministers, like Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien puts it in his typical exaggerated way, right? That the king should be able to sack his vizier if he doesn't like the cut of his trousers, right? Okay, that's a little exaggerated, but like if you had that, maybe we wouldn't have such an overweening huge. I mean, remember Tolkien says that government should only be used as a verb. There shouldn't be this institution called government. It's only persons exercising governance who do this. And I'll say this too: America has done pretty well with its presidential system. I won't deny that. Very few other places have, like most Latin American presidential systems, and even America has had like over 20 government shutdowns, right? Because the checks and balances are so severe, and there's no mediating force. There was one government shutdown in Australia in '75, I want to say, in the mid '70s. There was a similar thing where the parties couldn't come to some kind of resolution, so the Governor General just fired the government, called an election, and they haven't had a government shutdown since. So I would suggest there is something to be said for there being more stability in a system where you have a monarch who doesn't do much, but is able to be sort of outside the fray. And if the checks and balances get to the point where nothing can be done, they ensure that governance still happens by being able to fire people. So I would suggest that there's more stability, and there's more stability in a constitutional monarchy, and if they exercised their clout a little more, there probably would be smaller government. But again, constitutional governments don't have as much legitimacy anymore, and I can't help but see that as being related to secularization. Right? I'm kind of with Lewis and Tolkien on this, right? That people see, it's this mystical religious tradition that's it's not rational, it's not democratic enough. If people still had more of that religious sense of loyalty and duty, they might see more legitimacy in the monarch, and the monarch would maybe be more willing to occasionally say, no, this legislation's bad, I'm not signing on to it. Or no, you're not a good ruler, this is a mess, I'm getting rid of you, all right?
Yeah, okay, there's a few interesting points there you're bringing up. Maybe I'll just try and touch on three of them. The growth of the state, I don't think, is necessarily tied to whether it's monarchy or presidential Republican system or whatnot. I think there's other reasons perhaps for that, with technocratic government that's taken shape in many places of the world. With the growth of personal tax as well, right? Which you've seen in the last 100 years, and because there's more funds, you're going to get more government, and there's different reasons for it. But I think your point though was that the monarchy brings more stability, right? Has this ability through veto
the British constitutional system. I'm not saying every monarchy ever, obviously, but
the one that we have. When I say monarchy, I mean the
okay.
Now here two problems that I can see with this. First being this, the Governor General, Lieutenant Governor hasn't really done that. I think you mentioned 1926. Like that's a long time ago. Like I think of Stephen Harper, right? When he prorogues Parliament. Well, there's a question is Michelle Jean, right? Is she going to step in and do something about it? And it was like, no, she's not. Like she's a Governor General. Like she just says yes, right? She's just a figurehead who assents, and of course she said yes. And there's all sorts of outcries that he couldn't prorogue Parliament, and the Governor General has to do something about it. Well, no, she's not going to do anything. So, there's a theory and there's a practice, right? Now the second issue would be, we see this in the Federalist Papers 10, I believe it is, where Madison's pointing out that ambition must be set against ambition. So you're talking about government shutdown or different layers, the way it's set up, particularly in the American Constitution, different layers of government. You're right, there will be some gridlock, but when ambition is set against ambition, it provides these natural checks and balances, which that's part of the system. So that it's supposed to happen, right? Now, some people might see that as a defect. Others might say, well, no, actually, that's a very important restraint on government getting away from what it's supposed to be doing. And so I think it's Federalist 51, where Madison's pointing out that okay, sure, a leader can have all sorts of, he's thinking elected representatives or whoever it is, can have religious or moral foundation or formation, but that's probably not enough to limit them when they actually have the reins of power in their hands, right? So that's why we have this system set up so they just can't get the keys and drive away, right? Whereas the British monarchy might be a good example here, right? Where Henry VIII is able to take the keys, all right, of Peter, which you see this, Prince Charles holding them, right? So he's now head of the state. Oh, sorry, not just head of the state, but also of the church. So this, to me, in practice, has some serious shortcomings.
See, Madison also said the least powerful branch of government will be the judiciary.
That grew later.
That's in the Federalist Papers too. He's like, well, because they're not, he really thought they were going to be the least powerful branch of government, which I actually think they are the monarchy in America. If you think of the monarchy, like if you think of Solomon, right? The monarch is the one who judges as well. Like that's essentially the Supreme Court of the U.S. Right? And there's no check on them, really, except other than this document that they're in charge of interpreting. That's a separate thing. But I'd argue that's these unelected figures in robes. I mean, there's that's more monarchical than the British system really is. But,
okay. I mean, okay.
So there's a defect in that.
Sure. I'm not saying, but
that's,
I mean,
that
does come later after Madison, right? So
there's nothing in place to stop it from happening, though. Like he thinks that they're going to defer.
Right.
But they don't.
Yeah,
they just assert their own power and people roll with it. So.
Okay. Now you have the same weakness in Canada, right? With the judiciary, who arguably is much less democratic than
even though we've got that thing built into our constitution that should be a check on it. But anyways, that's another. Fair enough. So that's all true. I will grant you all of this. I think it works. This is what I'm trying to say, though.
Yep.
I'll sort of conclude with this, I guess.
Okay.
It works. It does work best with irreligious people, right? Because you're saying, well, the growth of the state is related to the technocracy, and you're absolutely right, I think. But Tolkien would say, that's incompatible with the thinking that goes with a monarchy, right? Of course, like a monarchy is more mystical. It's more of a fairy tale. There's a reason why you don't have presidents in fairy tales, right? There's something fantastical about it, which is incompatible with the kind of disenchanted, legal, rational way of thinking that we have in the modern world.
Yeah.
And that's to the credit of monarchy, that thinking that way is incompatible with this, right? If we caught a little bit of that fire, maybe that would be a check against.
Okay. Now I think that leads to a very interesting discussion. So that this anti-modern streak, because it obviously predates the modern era, and all the rest, despite its developments within the modern era, right? So I think that leads to a very interesting discussion, which is one I think on the forefront of many Christians today, is what type of government ought we to have or pursue. And I think this takes us beyond our current discussion, but even just to put it out there. So there's some going back and forth. So Rod Dreher, for instance, his Benedict option, is going to argue that, no, we need a classical liberal system, like a Lockean one, where you have these massive checks. Why? Because we can't trust whoever's running the government to put it in place, right? So in that system, you have these checks and balances which prevents the growth of government, so that if they're gone astray, let's say they're completely heathen, at least will be protected. Some of his interlocutors say, no. Actually, what we need to do is have conversion of our leaders. So we do need to keep this more top-down system, and we have to just make sure we can get Christians in there who can then help put in place the right rules and so on. And I think that may be a discussion for another time, but it's more a glass empty or half full. Like, do you think that will actually happen, that there'll be a conversion of hearts amongst those in power, or do you think, no, we just need to settle for what is the least worse. Sorry,
Sure.
the system
yeah.
that offends us the least, and then work with that.
Well, that's where
instead.
someone like Thomas More's were interesting to look at, right? Like, what do you do within a system where you're the only good one, or something like that, right?
Right.
Interesting. Who, by the way, says he's the king's good servant, but God's first. Like,
Right.
he remains a monarchist right up until the end. Here.
Well, then the question would be, how many St. Thomas More's are there left, right, in the system? And barring that, if there aren't, what type of system should we have?
Well,
Okay.
I guess my thought would be,
Yeah.
this is what I will close with. I won't add anything really beyond
Sure.
this, except in response to any comments you have.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Plato earlier.
Yes.
Right? And you can't, I mean, the state can't make people good, but it can orient them towards. And Fortescue says this too, by the way. He talks about Augustine as well, and the idea that, like, our ultimate good has to be found beyond this world. The state should have a role in pointing us in that direction, right? And again, speaking of Canadians, I feel like Canadians have done a better job defending the monarchy than British writers that I've seen, particularly the Anglican ones. George Grant is one, John Farthing, I mentioned, is another. We mentioned before, was it Taylor says he turns Plato into a good Anglican, right?
Oh, right.
That there
Yes.
should be,
Yeah.
that system where the Church of England is the institutional church, but you don't have to be, well, now you don't have to be Anglican anymore. Fortunately, there's Catholic emancipation, but the state commends a certain form of worship to people.
Yeah.
In some sense, that's what the British monarchy is supposed to be doing, though,
Right.
It's does everyone have to be Christian? No, but it's commending this forward. I mean, let me say that this was something that was different. So we mentioned before the coronation has changed. Charles added a prayer. In the past, the monarch hasn't actually prayed at the coronation.
Okay.
But he adds his own prayer, it's pretty brief, so I'll just read it. He says, God of compassion and mercy, whose Son was sent not to be served but to serve, give grace that I may find in your service perfect freedom, and in that freedom knowledge of thy truth. Grant that I may be a blessing to all thy children of every faith and belief, that together we may discover the ways of gentleness and be led into the paths of peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Right. So,
Yeah.
this system, I think
It's a beautiful prayer.
It really is. It's lovely. And it's open-ended. It's for everybody. But he's to use the papal phrase that Fortescue uses this too. That he's the servant of the servants of God.
Yeah.
Right. He's the king who washes the feet of his subjects and everything. And so, I mean, like I said, in the Middle Ages, I think there was actually more checks and balances because the king was able to, after 1707, you have parliamentary sovereignty basically in the Glorious Revolution. So now the king has to just rubber stamp Parliament. I'm not saying that's the best model either. Like I said, I would like for the king to be able to occasionally step out and overrule things and strike down laws and get rid of people. I'm not saying the way it currently is the best be-all and end-all. But I think there's an interesting promise there of something like a Christian Platonic political system where there's the king who has this duty upon him. And Charles is really interesting. I mean, his whole biography, we all know about his moral failing, which, his father kind of encouraged it, sow your wild oats and all this kind of thing. But he's very traditionalist. There's a wonderful speech he gave to a traditional society right here in Edmonton about the need to kind of discover traditional philosophy and religion and re-enchant the modern world. And he loves traditional architecture.
Yeah.
Also founded I think the biggest charity in English history or something like that, the Prince's Trust.
Okay.
So I think Charles actually is not a bad example of a sort of heroic figure for us to look up to. But is the British Constitution the only one anyone can ever have? Subsidiarity would probably say no. Every nation probably has their own unique system that's going to develop based on the character of the people. But I think that we should appreciate the Platonic and Aristotelian advantages of this one. Before we talk about doing another Oliver Cromwell thing and replacing it with with a non-monarch who just acts like a monarch, to see what is the Christianity element of it? Is there some wisdom that we've inherited that we should reappreciate that maybe was on display in that coronation ceremony? That's my final comment on that.
Okay, yeah. No, I certainly I appreciate. I mean, that just commenting on the prayer there. I mean, that's profound, right? And the whole vision, I think, is has a certain beauty to it, an attraction, an allure, in theory, right? I guess my question then would be, as far as the land of Britain is concerned, to what end is it more inclined towards the New Jerusalem, given that it has a monarchy, right? And if you just look on practice on the ground, church attendance, I think, is in this low single digits, right? So to that extent, I'm not sure. Now, you mentioned something really interesting about how the state is to commend the worship of the populace. And I think it still does. I mean, our current Prime Minister's somewhat made an infamous comment about Canada not having a culture, or words to that effect, right? But I don't think maybe that was too generous. I think it does, and then in fact, I think the apparatus of the state, which has evolved, but it still has this idea of orienting the vision of the citizenry through, let's say, the CRTC, CBC would be a good example as well, where there is a vision which they are trying to instill. Sorry. Yeah, it's a sign that we got to wrap up. But they're trying to instill a vision within us. The question is it one that is actually, well, to Zion above, right? Or where is it actually leading? So it's giving us a goal. I would question if that's the one that we want to be following. In any case, maybe we can leave it there, perhaps.
Well, I'm sure we have lots of seeds of ideas for future podcasts from this. But I think I appreciate your position more. Do you feel you appreciate my ancestors' sacrifice a little more?
I do. Next time you send an email, I'm going to look for that UE.
Yeah, the signature of UE. Well, if I send it to any of you out there now, you'll know what it means.
Yes.
All right, let's conclude. Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
Amen.
Saint Isidore,
Pray for us.